There's a truth about the Book of Revelation, a truth the Church has concealed for almost 2,000 years. Today, you will uncover exactly what they've kept hidden. What I'm about to share will fundamentally alter your understanding of one of history's most enigmatic texts, because the revelation is not what you've been taught. Have you ever questioned why a book about the end times dwells so extensively on inner transformation? Why it emphasizes eyes that open and ears that hear more than worldwide cataclysms? The answer will astound you. For centuries, early Christians interpreted Revelation in a radically different way. They possessed knowledge deliberately erased from the official interpretation. Knowledge that, were you to grasp it, would forever change your life. But before I reveal my discovery, I need you to understand something crucial. What I'm about to share isn't some conspiracy theory. It's documented historical fact, suppressed because it threatened institutional power. Imagine for a moment discovering that the Bible's most feared book was, in reality, a manual for personal liberation, a guide to transcending mental suffering while still alive. How would you feel knowing this information had been censored? The word revelation originates from the Greek apocalypsis. It doesn't signify destruction. It means revelation, unveiling, removing the veil that obscures the truth. And what was this truth that demanded unveiling? John, the author of Revelation, was describing an internal process, a journey of consciousness awakening, a journey accessible to every human being, but not just any way, a specific way that challenges the entire structure of religious control. Do you know the first indication that something was being hidden? In 367 A.D., when Bishop Athanasius compiled the first official list of biblical books, he almost excluded Revelation. Why? Because this book was too dangerous for the Church's authority. For 3 centuries, early Christian communities used Revelation as a text for meditation. They weren't anticipating the end of the world. They used the symbolic imagery to transcend the world of the mind, to access elevated states of consciousness. But this created a huge problem, as people could access the divine directly through the inner practices described in Revelation. Why would they need a religious institution mediating that connection? The answer is obvious. They wouldn't. And that's precisely what happened. During the early centuries of Christianity, groups emerged that interpreted Revelation as a blueprint for what Eckhart Tolle now calls spiritual awakening. They found in John's words a precise description of the end of the ego, not the end of the world. Consider this for a moment. What truly ends during a spiritual awakening? The physical world? No. What ends is the identification with thoughts, the belief that you are your mind, the prison of the ego. And that's exactly what John was describing. When he writes about a new heaven and a new earth, he's not talking about a future cosmic event. He's describing how reality is perceived after awakening. Everything seems new, no longer seeing through the distorted lens of the ego. Early church perceived something dangerous in this interpretation. Revelation were truly about personal transformation and individual awakening. People wouldn't need to wait for external salvation. They wouldn't depend on rituals, sacraments, or religious authorities. They could access the sacred directly. This was unacceptable. Around the 4th century, a systematic campaign began to interpret Revelation. Internal metaphors were transformed into literal prophecies. Descriptions of states of consciousness became predictions of future catastrophes. Result? A text about immediate liberation, was transformed into a text about fear and depths. Can you see the cruel brilliance of this manipulation? Instead of empowering people to seek their own spiritual transformation, revelation was used to create anxiety about future events. Instead of showing how to transcend suffering now, it was used to justify suffering as something necessary until the end times. Here's what they couldn't completely erase. There are traces everywhere, details in the original text that make no sense if you're expecting a literal catastrophe, but make perfect sense if you understand that John was describing internal states of consciousness. I'll give you an example that will open your eyes. John speaks of 7 seals that need to be opened. In the literal interpretation, these seals unleash plagues and destruction upon the earth. But in the original, censored interpretation, these 7 seals represent the 7 energy centers of the human body, the chakras. When these centers are opened through specific practices, the person experiences an expansion of consciousness. Each seal opened represents a deeper level of awakening. Coincidence? Absolutely not. John was using symbolic language that was perfectly understandable to the spiritual practitioners of his time. But this language was deliberately misinterpreted to create a narrative of fear and control. And it doesn't stop there. When John describes the beast with the number 666, he's not talking about a future entity. He's describing the nature of the human ego. The number 666 in ancient numerology represents imperfection, identification with the material world, unconsciousness. The beast that must be defeated isn't out there. It's inside each of us. It's the compulsive mental voice that keeps us trapped in patterns of suffering. You starting to see the pattern? Every apocalyptic symbol that has been interpreted as an external threat was originally a description of internal processes, compass for spiritual navigation. But perhaps the most shocking example of censorship is what happened to the concept of the rapture. In the popular modern interpretation, the rapture is when people are physically taken to heaven while others remain on earth to suffer tribulation. But in the original, censored understanding, the rapture describes something completely different. It was the moment when consciousness raptures itself from mental conditioning. When you cease identifying with automatic thoughts and emotions, when you realize that there is a dimension of yourself that is greater than any external circumstance. This doesn't happen in the future. It can happen now. This very moment. That's precisely the message that the institutional church couldn't allow to spread. Because if people knew they could experience immediate spiritual liberation through practices described in the book of Revelation itself, the entire system of religious control would collapse. There would be no need. And this freedom, that is the real threat. That's why the Revelation was reinterpreted, why its original message was censored, why you've never heard of these interpretations in any traditional church. You don't need to wait to be saved. You can awaken now. But how does this work in practice? How can you apply the censored teachings of the Revelation to your real life? How can you use these revelations to transcend your own patterns of suffering? This is exactly what I'm going to show you next. Because knowing the truth about the censorship is only the first step. The second step is learning to use that truth for your own transformation. So take a deep breath, get ready, because what comes next will connect the dots between the ancient wisdom of the Revelation and modern teachings on spiritual awakening. Are you ready to discover how to apply to your life the secrets that have been hidden for 2,000 years? I'll tell you something that changed my life forever. When I discovered these interpretations of the revelation, I realized that John was describing exactly the same process that Eckhart Tolle teaches in The Power of Now. The only difference? John used the symbolic language of the first century, but the essence is identical. Tolle talks about observing thoughts without identifying with them. John called this conquering the beast. Tolle teaches about conscious presence. John described it as remaining awake while others sleep. Now you're going to learn the practical technique that connects these two worlds. The first censored revelation you can apply today is hidden in the description of the 7 seals. But to understand how to use this, I need to tell you about a discovery that left me speechless. In Gnostic texts found in 1945 in Egypt, we discovered that early Christians practiced something called apocalyptic meditation. They used the images from John's book as anchors for deep meditative states, and it worked. Each seal corresponded to a specific level of consciousness that could be accessed through precise techniques. Techniques that were systematically erased because they created total spiritual independence. I'm going to teach you the first one. The first seal represents the awakening of conscious observation. John describes this as a white horse whose rider had a bow. In ancient symbolic language, the white horse represents mental purity. The bow represents the ability to direct attention. Modern practice. This means developing the ability to observe your thoughts without being dragged away by them. Here's the exact technique adapted for today. Sit comfortably. Close your eyes. Imagine yourself riding a white horse, holding a golden bow. The horse is your purified mind. The bow is your conscious attention. Now, whenever a thought appears, visualize yourself pointing the bow in the direction of that thought, not to destroy it, but to observe it with total precision. The thought loses power the moment you consciously observe it. This is exactly what Tolle calls the silent witness. But John was already teaching this 2,000 years ago, using the metaphor of the first horseman of the Revelation. Do you see the brilliance of this? The texts that were censored contained a complete system of spiritual practices, step-by-step guide to transcending mental suffering. But everything was reinterpreted as prophecy about future events to keep people dependent on external salvation. Second seal is even more powerful. John describes a red horse whose rider had power to take peace from the earth. A literal, censorious interpretation. This represents war and global conflict. But in the original understanding, this describes a specific stage of spiritual awakening. It's the moment when you realize that all the peace you thought you had was based on ego illusions. Relationships that seemed secure but were based on emotional need. Achievements that seemed satisfying but were just attempts to fill an inner void. When this false peace is taken away, you enter a spiritual crisis. Everything you believed about yourself begins to crumble. Tolle calls this the dark night of the soul. John called it the second seal. And here is the censored technique to navigate this stage. You feel your life is crumbling when old securities no longer work. Visualize yourself as the rider of the red horse. You are not a victim of destruction. You are the conscious agent of the destruction of illusions. Each thing that crumbles in your life is an ego illusion being dissolved. Each moment of insecurity is an invitation to find security in what can never be destroyed, your essential consciousness. Instead of resisting the crisis, Embrace it as a necessary part of awakening. But it's in the third seal that the censorship becomes most obvious. John speaks of a black horse whose rider had a balance in his hand. Distorted interpretation, this represents worldwide hunger and scarcity. Original understanding, this describes the development of spiritual discernment. Balance represents the ability to distinguish between ego and essential consciousness, between useful thoughts and compulsive thoughts, between true love and emotional dependence. This is the stage where you develop what Tolle calls alert presence, the ability to be fully conscious of each moment without being dominated by automatic reactions. The censored technique for this level, throughout the day, imagine yourself holding a golden balance. On one side, place each thought, emotion, or reaction that arises. On the other side, place the question, is this coming from the ego or from consciousness? With practice, you develop instant discernment. You can immediately perceive when you are acting from mental conditioning or when you are responding from conscious presence. But it is in the fourth seal that the connection with Tolle becomes impossible to ignore. John describes a pale horse whose rider was death. Everyone interprets this literally as physical death. But John was describing the death of the ego. It's the moment of complete awakening, when identification with thoughts and emotions simply ceases. You realize you were never your ideas about yourself, never your emotions, never your personal history. You are the consciousness that observes all of this. Tolle calls this death before death. John called it the fourth seal. There's a specific technique to facilitate this experience. Sit in silence, close your eyes, ask the question, who am I without my thoughts? Who am I without my emotions? Who am I without my history? Keep asking until you reach what never changes, pure consciousness that is always present, observing everything. When you touch this dimension of yourself, even for a few seconds, the fear of death disappears. You realize that what you truly are never was born and can never die. This is exactly what Jesus meant when he spoke of eternal life. Not life after death, life beyond identification with the ego. Here's where the censorship becomes criminal. The last three seals describe the most advanced stages of awakened consciousness, states that can be achieved by anyone through dedicated practice. But these teachings were so completely erased that today, only a few spiritual masters like Tolle can describe these states. The fifth seal speaks of souls under the altar crying out for justice. Censored interpretation, this becomes a prophecy about future, but in the original understanding, this describes the stage where you realize that all human suffering comes from not only for people who suffer, but consciousness itself that causes the suffering. It's like waking up in a hospital and realizing that all the patients are sick without knowing they are sick. The sixth seal describes the sun turning black and the moon like blood, literally interpreted as cosmic catastrophe. But symbolically, this represents the moment when all your external references to happiness disappear. No longer need success to feel good. No longer need approval to have peace. You no longer need specific circumstances to access joy. Your happiness becomes independent of external conditions. And the seventh seal. The seventh seal is pure transcendence. John describes silence in heaven for half an hour. There are no symbols, no metaphors, only silence. It's the state that Tolle calls stillness, pure consciousness without content, the silent space from which all thoughts emerge and to which they return. When you access this state, even for a few moments, you understand that this conscious silence is your true nature. Everything else is just phenomena that appear and disappear in this eternal space. Now pause for a moment. Breathe deeply. Feel the impact of what you've just discovered. For 2,000 years, a complete manual of spiritual awakening has been hidden in one of the most widely read books in the world. The techniques I've just shared were practiced by entire communities in the early centuries of Christianity. They were censored, erased, reinterpreted. Why? Because they reveal a truth that no institution wants you to know. Don't need anything external to access high states of consciousness. You don't need specific rituals, specific doctrines, or specific spiritual authorities. You already have everything you need. You always have. The door to transcendence is not somewhere distant. It's here, now, in this moment, and this is the true apocalypse. The revelation that the kingdom of heaven that Jesus spoke of is not a future physical place. It's a state of consciousness available with every breath. But there's something even deeper I need to tell you. When you truly understand and apply these censored teachings, you stop seeing the revelation as a book about destruction and begin to see it as a poem about rebirth. Every symbol of destruction represents something being dissolved within you. Every catastrophe represents a mental limitation being transcended. Every end times represents the end of psychological time, the liberation from the past and the future to live fully in the present. That's why John ends the book with the vision of a new Jerusalem descending from heaven. It's not a future physical city. It's how you will perceive your ordinary life when you fully awaken. Everything will seem new, sacred, perfect as it is. Even your everyday problems will become opportunities to practice presence. Even your difficulties will become invitations to deepen your awakening. Here's the most beautiful irony of all. The church tried to use the revelation to create fear about the future. John was writing about the possibility of transcending all fear in the present. They tried to use the book to create dependence on external salvation. But John was describing how to access inner freedom immediately. They tried to use John's words to control, but John was offering total liberation. Truth always finds a way. Today, through masters like Eckhart Tolle, through courageous researchers who question official narratives, this truth is emerging again. You are now part of this emergence. You carry with you knowledge that has been hidden for centuries. You have access to practices that have been censored for millennia. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Will you continue living as if you need to wait for external salvation? You use these teachings to awaken now, in this life, in this moment, because this is the true apocalyptic choice, not between salvation and damnation, but between unconsciousness and awakening, between identification with the ego and recognition of essential consciousness, between continuing to sleep or waking up to who you really are. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you came here today. Not by chance, but because the time has come for you to discover that the kingdom of heaven you have always sought has never been anywhere else. It has always been here, inside you, waiting to be recognized. The personal apocalypse has already begun.